recent interviews, George R. R. Martin has talked about how he originally pushed for the idea of House of the Dragon starting much sooner in the timeline than it did. House of the Dragon technically starts with the Great Council of 101, where Viserys is chosen as heir to Jaehaerys. It then jumps forward to a point where Rhaenyra is a teenager and Aemma Arryn is heavily pregnant. I'm not sure when in the show's timeline this would be, but in the books it would be 105 AC. So from this, it's fair to mention that the show's characters' ages are very different, and the timeline itself, I think, is being kept intentionally vague due to these changes. When I watched episode 1, it made perfect sense to open with the Great Council of 101, then jump forward into Viserys' reign and the death of Aemma. It sets up the season nicely with the perfect endpoint just after the death of Viserys and the Black and the Green Council. Now, if George R. R. Martin's idea was followed, all the events from Season 1 would likely have made up Season 2 of House of the Dragon. George wanted to explore more of the late reign of Jaehaerys, following the lives and rivalries of his heir and his spare, Aemon and Baelon, the father of Viserys and Daemon and Rhaenys. The season itself would focus on the story of how the seemingly secure succession ended up needing a great council in the first place, and the butterfly effect of inadvertently causing the Dance of the Dragons to happen at all. From what George has said, Aemon and Baelon would have been the focus of the first season. We'd explore their close relationship, friendship, and rivalry. There was also a suggestion that some of Jaehaerys' and Alysanne's younger children, such as Sarah, and their stories might have made up some of the plot. The idea of the season would have been to give context to the conflict that would have made up Season 2. I believe there would have been a lot more focus on the passing over of Rhaenys in favour of Baelon after Aemon's death. While they do cover this in Season 1 of House of the Dragon, I feel the complexity of the situation is never fully explained, and I feel a lot of it comes down to the fact that in the show, the vote of the Great Council of 101 is between Viserys and Rhaenys rather than Viserys and Laenor, as in Fire and Blood. I believe if the show had started earlier, we would have gotten the original version of the Great Council, and Corlys Velaryon's level of anger and disdain for the situation in the show would make a lot more sense, as then both his wife and his son were passed over. There would still be a lot of room for action during this time period. We had the Myrish bloodbath that would have taken at least a couple of episodes to cover. You would have the initial invasion of Tarth and Aemon's death, then we'd also have Baelon's vengeance. This would also include, of course, a lot of dragon combat with Vhagar. They could expand Aemon's role in the Myrish bloodbath and have him fight a bit using Caraxes before he's killed. Then, in this time period, you would still have a lot of political intrigue after Aemon's death and Baelon being named as heir, and more so after the death of Baelon and the lead up to the Great Council of 101. Lots of political scheming from both sides. Aemon, Baelon, and the passing over of Rhaenys would be the centre of the narrative, I think, but there would also be a lot of setup for Viserys and Daemon, and maybe even the birth of Rhaenyra. We could possibly have even seen the last of the Sea Snake's 9 voyages, and widen the scope of the world a little bit. But in the background of all this, you have the chaos that is the life of Jaehaerys' younger children going on as well. All factors that ultimately lead to the Great Council of 101. Plus, a little bonus, probably gotten to see Balerion the Blackdread in live action, which is something I know lots of fans are really keen to see. An idea I did have, using Archmaester Vagon, you could perhaps introduce characters such as Otto Hightower a little bit earlier than they would be, with maybe Vagon interacting with him in Old Town before Otto becomes Hand. But was George R. R. Martin's idea of starting that far back into the reign of Jaehaerys actually a good one? Well, yes and no. It depends on a few factors. Now, let me say this first. I love Jaehaerys, and I would love to see more of him in live action. However, looking at the story from a casual audience point of view, and I'm not sure there's enough to get them invested in the story quickly, as there is with the Dance of the Dragons and the Season 1 that we did end up getting. While it would have been a delight for more hardcore fans, I feel without the context of knowing where the story leads because we've read the books, or watched the animated shorts, casual fans might not have clicked with the show in the same way. Starting the show where they did makes sense in a lot of ways. They began early enough to set up and develop the characters, but also at the same time establish the vague backstory to the events, giving the viewer all the key information they needed via the more simple version of the Great Council of 101. Also, consider that Season 1 of House of the Dragon was in reality setting the stage for the real conflict to come in Season 2. If they'd gone with George's approach, Season 1 would have been setting the stage for setting the stage with the main conflict not coming until Season 3. Also, think about this. No one knew how well House of the Dragon was going to do after the fallout of Game of Thrones Season 8. It still amazes me how quickly Game of Thrones fell out of the pop culture mindset after Season 8. And I think objectively, looking at the lore of the Dance of the Dragons, it ticked most of the boxes they needed it to bring in fans and more casual audiences. But even so, for all HBO and the writers knew, House of the Dragon could have been a huge flop. I think after the success of the show, a lot of the fans have forgotten how uncertain the lead up was to House of the Dragon. Even I will hold my hands up and say I felt the show would do okay and get a second season, but I never thought it would become as popular as it has, and the numbers it pulled were frankly amazing, given what had come before. George R. R. Martin has even said in interviews there were some versions of Season 1 proposed that started with the death of Viserys, as HBO wanted to get to the meat of the conflict, which we will see in Season 2 as fast as possible. While I do think it could have worked still, the show would have been very different, and personally, I think you need the setup of Season 1 to make people care about what happens in Season 2. Imagine Game of Thrones has started with the second book, and with Ned Stark's execution, jumping right into the War of Five Kings. You're going to care about the characters involved a lot less without the context the first season gives you. So if George had to fight to get them to start at the Great Council of 101, then I can't think of a scenario where they start even earlier than that. It's easy to say in hindsight, knowing that the show is going to be successful, but given the mood of the audience at the time, I think they did probably make the right choice starting where they did. But I don't think this is the end for George's wish to have started the lives and deaths of Aemon and Baelon. If House of the Dragon does ever become an anthology after the Dance of the Dragons, then I can see them backtracking and covering this era just before Season 1 as sort of a Season 0 kind of thing. Given the investment in the story that we now have from both fans and more casual audiences, I have no doubt people will be invested in seeing the early lives of the characters they love. What do you think of George's original idea for starting House of the Dragon at an earlier point in time? Do you think it would have affected the success of the show if they had done? I'd be very keen to see what you have to say in the comments.